In this episode of Don't Talk TV, I'm going to talk about whether you still have the right to not answer the door to your home under the Quarantine Act, and what the possible consequences might be if you refuse a COVID test or refuse quarantine in a hotel upon arriving at an airport from international travel. Hello, my name is Nicholas Wansbutter. I'm a criminal defense lawyer in Stratford, Ontario, Canada, and this is Don't Talk TV. It's March 2021, and the rules and laws that govern our lives continue to change very frequently. In fact, it seems that they change almost daily. And that's why it's important to frequently review our rights and review those new laws and obligations so that we can understand what our duties, rights, and possible consequences are in this environment. I'm going to break this episode into two parts. The first part will deal with whether you have to answer the door to your home under the Quarantine Act, and under the second section we'll discuss the possible implications of international travel and tickets that you might receive versus being quarantined in a hotel. In episode 1 of Don't Talk TV, I covered the fact that you have the right not to answer the door to your home if you don't want to, and that there is no positive duty to answer the door to your home under the Criminal Code of Canada. Understandably, given current circumstances, people wonder, does that still hold in light of the Quarantine Act? The short answer is that I believe you still have no positive obligation to answer the door to your house. And to prove this, I want to look at the Quarantine Act itself. So I have the Quarantine Act pulled up here on the Government of Canada website. And firstly, I want to look under the powers that are given under Section 47 of that Act. And what's most interesting to me is Section 48 sub 1 of the Quarantine Act that states that a quarantine officer and an environmental health officer may not enter or inspect a dwelling place without the consent of its occupant, except under the authority of a warrant. This section clearly states that there is no power under the Quarantine Act for agents of the state to enter your home without your consent or a warrant. Obviously, consent is only consent if you have a choice in the matter. And in my view, if you have the right to decline entry into your house, you also have the right to decline to answer the door to your home. Next, I'd like to look at the offenses and punishments section. So the offenses we have listed here are entering a quarantine facility without authorization, leaving a quarantine facility without authorization, obstruction of an officer, which states specifically that no person shall hinder or willfully obstruct a quarantine officer or screening officer or an environmental health officer who is carrying out their duties or functions under this act, or make a false or misleading statement, either orally or in writing, to the officer. Now, as we discussed in episode 1, when dealing with obstruction of justice under the Criminal Code, a positive act that makes the officer's job more difficult is what's required. Declining to answer your door is not a positive act. It's not an act at all. It's the absence of an act. So I would suggest that that is clearly not obstruction. Now, there may be argument that declining to answer the door to your home hinders an officer, and I haven't been able to find any case law under this provision, but it would seem to me in the context of the section that hindrance would be akin to obstruction, and therefore, absent any clearly stated obligation to answer your door, it would not be a violation of this section if you simply didn't answer that door, nor would your failure to answer the door be proof that you weren't home. In fact, the presumption of innocence would require the belief that you are in fact home, absent evidence to the contrary, and simply not answering the door when there's no duty to do so would not be proof of that. Then Section 67.1 states that every person is guilty of an offense if they cause a risk of imminent death or serious bodily harm to another person while willfully or recklessly contravening this act or the regulations. Declining to answer your door couldn't possibly cause a risk of imminent death or bodily harm to anyone, and therefore would not run afoul of that section either. As always, the question is raised, why not answer the door if you have nothing to hide? Why not answer the door when you can be helping prevent the spread of COVID-19 by answering the door? Well, here's one possible reason why you might not want to answer the door if you have nothing to hide. This article from CTV News is titled, Ontario COVID-19 Quarantine Screening Officer Charged with Extortion Sexual Assault. And it says here, according to the police, the accused informed the victim that they were in violation of the quarantine order and demanded that a fine be paid in cash. When the victim declined to pay, she was sexually assaulted by the accused. The article goes on to note that issues have previously arisen with quarantine guards. Last year, private security contractors at a quarantine hotel in Melbourne, Australia were accused of sleeping with guests. And even in Canada, this is not an isolated incident, as we see from this article, indicating that there have been 2 incidents of sexual assault in the context of the quarantine hotels. Therefore, I would suggest it would be a perfectly valid reason to not want to answer your door because you don't want to be at risk of extortion or sexual assault. And while I try to be apolitical on this channel, this is something that is directly within my wheelhouse as a criminal defense lawyer. This case highlights one of the grave dangers of privatization of law enforcement. So the context to this article is that Public Health Canada has contracted with private security firms, 4 of them in fact, although the police are refusing to name which company the screening officer in question worked for. But this is clearly privatized law enforcement. One of the problems with privatized law enforcement is they have a different set of priorities than public law enforcement do. Public law enforcement are employed by the government, and the purpose of government is to maintain law and order and protect the citizens. The purpose of private corporations is to make as much money as possible for the shareholders. And private businesses, by their very nature, are always going to try to minimize costs and maximize profit, whereas in public law enforcement, profit is not part of the equation. As such, the way that private law enforcement conducts itself will generally be different from the way traditional law enforcement conducts itself. This also highlights the grave danger of taking an ends justifies the means mentality when it comes to people's civil liberties and their rights. We're now over a year into a scenario where Section 1 of the Charter has been constantly invoked to place restrictions upon rights which have been enjoyed by Canadians for decades. In my view, the infringement of rights begets the further infringement of rights. The less value that rights hold in society, the less people will respect them, and it's my suspicion that we will continue to see more and more of these sorts of cases as our civil liberties are less and less valued in society, and this ends justifies the means equation. That's why on Don't Talk TV, I constantly talk about the Charter of Rights and Freedoms and Canadians' rights, and why I make it a priority to point out what people's rights are and why I encourage people to exercise those rights, even if they, quote, don't have anything to hide, unquote. Now in part 2 of this video, I want to look a little bit at the new quarantine rules that have come into effect for individuals arriving at international airports from traveling abroad, and the requirement that they quarantine in a hotel at their expense upon arrival back in Canada. Now, these hotels are apparently quite expensive. According to what I've read, they're in the vicinity of $2,000 for a 3-night stay. What is the penalty for refusing to stay in that expensive hotel? It's a provincial offense ticket. I have one more news article I want to look at here, again from CTV News, titled Some Travelers from Toronto Pearson International Airport Violating Quarantine Act. So the article is about people refusing to stay in the hotel. And it says that Peel Region Police said that while most cases were resolved after conversations with officers, some people refused to follow the rules that took effect this week and were fined $880 under Ontario regulations. Police said that they will not detain anyone for breaking hotel quarantine rules unless there are aggravating circumstances involved, such as a criminal offense. While I certainly applaud the Peel Regional Police for the approach that they're taking to this, I think I do have to point out to viewers that under the Quarantine Act, they actually do have the power to make an arrest. I'm looking now at Section 18 of the Quarantine Act, and it says here that a peace officer may, at the request of a screening officer or quarantine officer, arrest without a warrant and bring to a quarantine officer any traveler who the peace officer has reasonable grounds to believe has refused to be isolated or refuses to comply with a measure under Section 15 sub 3. So I think it's important to be aware that that is a possibility. You could be arrested by police and forced into isolation, but as a practical matter, it appears that the police are taking a very reasonable approach and an approach that respects people's rights and simply issuing an $880 ticket. Certainly, I do not counsel anyone to commit an offense. However, in assessing what you choose to do in a situation, it's valid for you to consider an $880 ticket versus a 3-night stay in a hotel for $2,000 and potentially longer stay. I think it's also reasonable to consider the living conditions that you may be subjected to while living in that $2,000 per 3-night hotel. There's a video here that was posted on the Post-Millennial News website where you can see a number of people staying in one of these quarantine hotels arguing with staff over the fact that they haven't been fed. Some may question whether the $880 ticket would even result in a conviction. A few people have sent to me a video from a gentleman named Skye, where he makes this claim.
Refuse the test. Ooh, I'm getting a ticket! Oh, not another one of those tickets! You know, tell everybody how many people have been convicted of those tickets in Canada. Answer? 0. How many people have been charged? Thousands. How many people convicted? 0. Why? It's a violation of our charter rights. So when that ticket goes to court, they throw it the out. It's that simple. So I'm waiting for my little fine.
Now, with all due respect to Mr. Skye, although I don't have personal knowledge of this, I'm quite confident that he's wrong. I don't think it's possible that all of these tickets have already been thrown out. Most likely, they have not even made it to court yet, and that's why there have been no convictions. As viewers of Don't Talk TV may know, from March to about September of 2020, the entire justice system was closed down, and while criminal courts opened in September and October of 2020, provincial offences courts waited even longer to reopen, resulting in a massive backlog at all levels. As such, it's most likely that these tickets have not even had their first appearance, and they certainly have not had a trial yet. Therefore, I would not rely on Mr. Skye's comments that all tickets issued by police for COVID violations are being thrown out in court. So on this episode of Don't Talk TV, we've discussed whether you still have the right to not answer the door to your home under the Quarantine Act, and we've also discussed your rights and possible consequences when arriving at an international airport after travel abroad. This video is not legal advice. As always, you should consult a lawyer. You can either call myself at my 1-855 number below or another lawyer so that you can receive specific advice tailored to your particular situation. If you have any suggestions on topics that you'd like me to cover, please leave those in the comments box. And if you found this video helpful or informative, please consider liking, sharing, and subscribing.